I just got back from seeing the Great British Bake Off musical here in London's West End at the Noël Coward Theatre, and I've got to say, it definitely was a musical. It was one of the musicals I've ever seen, really. It certainly was. Written by Jake Brunger and Pippa Cleary, the musical follows a gang of 8 contestants and the hosts of the show, and they've worked with folks from the actual Great British Bake Off to kind of realise it in true-to-form fashion, and as a result, it is packed, absolutely ram-packed, jam-packed with in-jokes and references back to various seasons of the show, various contestants, various lines, things like that. And we'll get into whether or not that's a good thing in a moment, but first, I want to call out some amazing performances from the cast. First of all, I really enjoyed Michael Cahill in this. I thought he was fantastic. I also want to call out Anya Shah as Lily. She's a child actor. She plays the daughter of one of the contestants in the show, and I thought she was fantastic. I always want to sort of celebrate good performances in the area, so great job, Anya. But special highlights for me go to Claire Moore, who plays Babs. She's from London's famous East End, and she puts in an absolute shift in her sort of solo song in the second act, where she is singing about her love for the host of the show. I also really loved Charlotte Wakefield as Gemma. She has such a beautiful voice and so much strength in her voice, and carries all of the numbers where she's singing on her back, in my opinion. I thought she was just fantastic. And I want to give a special bit of recognition to Damien Humbly, who plays Ben, whose daughter is Lily, who I mentioned earlier. And Damien had so much come from away energy. It's hard to describe exactly why, but he just really gave off come from away energy, if you have any idea what that might mean. He was casual, he was human, he was normal, he was effortless, and his singing, despite the fact that he wasn't like jaw to the floor, really showing off his technique, was perfect. I thought his voice was gorgeous. I wish that we'd had more opportunities to see him sing, to hear him sing more frequently and on his own more often. And overall, thought that he was just stellar, and I definitely want to see him in other productions in the future. Everyone in the cast, though, does brilliantly. I don't want to make out like the rest of the folks that are in it were not doing their part or anything like that. Everyone was great. I just especially liked those performances. And I also want to give a thumbs up to Alice Power for her set design in this, because it doesn't necessarily take a huge number of risks, in my opinion. Like, there was never a moment in the show where I was like, wow, this has been staged in such an innovative way necessarily, or that they've done something that really subverted expectation. Not really. But what they did manage to achieve is the Bake Off set from TV realized on stage in a way that actually works for theatre. It's not too snazzy, it's not too chaotic, it's just enough, and I thought it worked really well. So Alice, thumbs up. And that brings us to the writing and the actual content of the show. So performances wise, fine, fantastic, great. But the writing is another kettle of fish. So, as I mentioned, there's lots of quotes from the actual TV show, there's lots of references and things like that, to the point that it feels like every other line is either some kind of pun, a gag, an innuendo, double entendre, or just a straight up quote. And it is relentless. Like, they are really trying to make this a funny show which is witty at pretty much all times. And the girls behind me, who were American, who were watching the show, and I heard them talking during the show and afterwards saying, oh my god, it's so British and it's so Bake Off and they got it all so right and all the quotes are there and it all just feels like I'm actually seeing it happen in front of me. For someone like that, this show does a really fantastic job because it feels bake-off-y. Like, they've succeeded in making it feel like the source material. But the problem for me is that kind of doesn't leave room for it to be a musical. Like, they went as far as saying, let's make a musical about Bake Off, but they didn't go as far as saying, let's use the power that musical theatre and just generally theatre has to elevate something that could happen within Bake Off, a story within Bake Off, and tell that story in a new way, in a way that this medium is capable of, that you wouldn't be able to tell on TV necessarily. And that's the beginning of where I think there are going to be two very different camps for who does and doesn't enjoy this musical. On the one hand, you have the folks behind me, like I said, who were there just for 3 hours of Bake Off fun. And they got 3 hours of Bake Off fun. They were singing, so it was a musical, and they were dancing, so it was a musical, and there were Bake Off jokes, so it was a Bake Off musical. And that was as much as they needed. And that's totally okay if you're going to the theatre for just 3 hours of fun in that way. No problems, I don't think. It doesn't really generate much emotion beyond a couple of sort of snorts, like, oh, yeah, that was funny, soggy bottom, hilarious. And it doesn't pull at your heartstrings, and it doesn't make you feel any real strong emotions, in my opinion. But it's 3 hours of song and dance and bake-off gags. So what's not to like, right? But then I come along, and I'm like, well, in the other camp, there's me hoping for something more here, and then seeing kind of sniffs of it through the show, but then very categorical decisions being made to veer away from what could have been interesting and instead returning straight back to safe bake-off territory. I wonder if the license holders of Bake Off, like the IP owners, were less involved here, if maybe more experimental stuff could have been achieved. I don't know. I don't know what the creative process was like for this show. But time and time again, you get a little hint that we're going in an interesting direction, and then it veers back to safety. One of the most egregious examples of this is the song Grow, sung by Kat Sanderson, who's playing an Italian woman called Francesca. And in the same way that pretty much all the songs in the musical use some kind of double meaning or pun to talk about some other real-life event, but to also talk about baking at the same time, this song revolves around the theme of having a bun in the oven. She's cooking buns in her oven, but she's also trying to get pregnant. And so you get to the chorus of this song, and the verse prior has talked about how she was taught by her grandma, her nonna, to bake. And then you get to the chorus, and it's grow, grow, grow. Fine so far. Bun in the oven. And you start to realize, oh my God, they're actually going there. And then she sings about how she can't get pregnant and she goes about it the NHS way. And despite all her efforts, she's unsuccessful. And it's written as a ballad, like it's meant to be a song where you feel sympathy for this character, I think, but it's so infantilized almost in some ways, or just unserious, that it doesn't feel emotional at all. Like the phrase buns in the oven isn't something that stirs up a lot of my heartstrings, right? And so this song finishes, which really should have been the She Used to Be Mine of this musical. And that final line comes in, grow, 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 bun in the oven, grow. And you're like, okay, we've got there, right? We've landed. And then she comes out with, but now I've replaced you with dough. Really? It just means that you can't take it seriously. And this happens time and time again. Any moment where I'm feeling like I'm meant to be beginning to start caring about a character, they just throw in a bunch of jokes and gags and puns that mean that it becomes completely unserious. It is self-aware of what Bake Off does in that regard. It's self-aware of Bake Off's silliness, which is great, but it doesn't give you room to connect emotionally with the cast of characters because it's leaning so far into the silliness and not into the humanity of the actual people that appear in the show. Nobody would care really about Bake Off if it was only about cake and puns. It's the humanity of the show, I think, that is a crucial, central factor that holds the rest of, pardon the pun, but the recipe together. And I've seen some critics that say, well, I think that it's just that they didn't have enough time in the show to make you care about the characters. Like Bake Off gets a whole season, and in this, we've just got a few minutes or a few hours where we're going to have to get to know these people and then care about them. But I'm sort of sitting there reading these reviews going, folks, have we forgotten the fact that every other musical does that exact job? And a lot of them, the good ones at least, really succeed in doing so. I came into Standing at the Sky's Edge not knowing anything about that situation and finishing the musical in floods of tears, complete floods. And so you're telling me that they managed to do it and make me care about Sheffield, which I've never been to, and I don't know anyone personally from Sheffield, but in a context where they've picked a person from every walk of life. They've got a guy doing his GCSEs. They've got a guy who's an engineer. They've got a woman who's recently lost her mother and she's suffering through that. Another guy who's a single dad. Like, they've got all these different people, and you're telling me that they just didn't have enough time to make me really connect to any of them? I don't buy it. So I don't think time is an excuse here. And similarly, you could argue that, well, they've got a large cast. Like, there's 8 people, 8 contestants, and you have to care about all of them. But again, it happens in so many other places, in so many other musicals, they're successful. And in this one, I think that they just prioritize the gag over the connection in pretty much all instances. Or the pacing is just a little wonky, and in the instance of this character Francesca singing about her buns in the oven, for instance, she, fairly soon after singing this song, is voted out, and she's no longer in the running to be the winner of the show. So she gets a lot less stage time as a result. And so I kind of think to myself, well, what if instead they had just spent a lot more focus and time on the kind of core, maybe 3 or 4 characters, if time and stage time is what they needed, and then you could let those characters' lives breathe a little bit more and just have some of the folks on the show being just there. Like, just have them as a little gag here and there, but don't force your way through giving everyone a solo song just so that you feel like you know everyone that's present. I don't think that would be necessary, and I think you'd maybe tell a better story as a result because you'd feel more connected to whoever your central characters were. In this regard, and actually I thought this through the show multiple times, it feels more like a panto in some areas than it does a musical, which was so interesting to me because I'm not a panto guy, and I know people love their pantos, and I'm not trying to sort of detract from the value of all that here, but what I'm saying is that in a panto, it is usually much more just levity across the board, the innuendos, the silly jokes, the different characters getting their solos, and it getting more and more kind of chaotic and funny and silly, and then it ends and it's like, great. The big bad was never really a big bad. It all gets resolved, everyone's happy, and that's fantastic. And this is kind of the direction that Bake Off goes in as well. Another example, okay? There's a student, he's 17 years old, he lives in Wembley, but it turns out that he's actually from Syria. He grew up in Syria and then moved here when he was maybe 9 years old or something. When you're introduced to this character, he raps in attempted Lin-Manuel Miranda style the following: I don't need no recipes, I make it up myself. I just throw it in a bowl. Yeah, throw it in a bowl. I'm never phased, I don't care about tradition. I'm Hassan, I follow intuition. And when he said this line, I was screaming. Internally, for the record, no bodyguard scenario here, I was just so sad that the introduction to this character was so heavy-handed in this way. And throughout, like, he has plenty of other instances where he's sort of doing a little rappy bit, and it sounds like it wants to be Lin so badly. But I think it really makes you realize how good Lin's writing is. Because in these instances, in Bake Off, it sounds like the sort of thing that you'd see written under the comments section of a free beat someone had uploaded to YouTube. Like, I'm a lyrical, miracle, spiritual individual. Those sorts of bars are the sorts of things that come out of Hassan's mouth, which maybe is realistic for a 17-year-old, but when it gets in the way of us connecting with his character, I don't care about realism there. I want them to be well-written lines, and it just felt a bit clunky to me. And speaking of Hassan, like I said, grew up in Syria, they touch on, for a moment, the fact that it's the British Bake Off, and he's kind of questioning where he fits in as someone that partially doesn't feel British, but also partially does. And they tiptoe towards this little bit of territory, and then they run away from it and go straight back to baking. He ends the show pretty much by saying, I don't think I'm going to be able to make it back to Syria. And I was sort of sitting there like, really? That's the message? Like, is there an attempt there to make people feel good about being British? Maybe because we've got folks from other countries here, but we haven't actually spent any time exploring the real difficulties that are also wrapped up in that whole thing. Like, is it just meant to be, oh, I'm not sure how British I am, and then, oh yeah, baking makes me British, so I'm British. Yay! Like, it felt like they were almost trying to score brownie points, but because it did none of the emotional labor that are required to earn any points there, I would question anyone sitting in the audience that would get to the end and see this resolution for him and go, oh, that's so nice. Or anything really in that regard. Like, it's just, I don't know, it was weird. And on top of all of those things, a lot of the songs feel like they last a really long time. Like there were a few numbers where they'd be singing and I'd be like, okay, yep, it's a new song and I'm vibing with this and okay, cool, great. But then it would just keep on going. Or maybe the song would finish and they'd even get their applause and they'd go right back to it like an instant reprise type situation. But we'd already be what felt like 6 or 7 minutes into the song and it would just be like, please folks, this is feeling almost gratuitous at this point. So all of the prior stuff that I've mentioned notwithstanding, you get to the end of the show, right? And as you can expect, a show about Bake Off, you expect there to be a final and for someone to win or something. And bizarrely, you don't get to know who wins because they're about to announce the winner. Like it's genuinely and the winner is situation. And then they just don't tell you. Instead, it kind of goes mute. Like everyone just starts hugging each other, but they're not actually speaking out loud anymore. So you don't know who's won. And then they have a final number where they sing "Good Things Come to Those Who Bake." And midway through, they're like, oh, you probably wanted to know who won, didn't you? Well, you'll have to watch the show for that. And again, it's like, oh my God, is this just an advert at this point? Am I watching an ad for the actual TV show? Or is this meant to be a theatre production that stands on its own? And at that point, I was like, well, it doesn't stand on its own, in my view. It's not that I actually cared about not knowing who won in that moment, because I thought that there was a world where they just sort of cut to black there and it's like, okay, fine, it's a weird choice, but I would sort of respect it. It was the sort of almost gloating kind of feel of like, well, yeah, I mean, this is just the theatre. You don't get the full thing at the theatre. You have to go to the TV show for that. It just didn't sit well with me. I think there are plenty more ways they could have had a more inventive ending here, something more fun. But what we got was a pretty flat ending to a somewhat flat musical. It was a musical, they sang, they danced, they made the Bake Off jokes, but it was as safe and as average as you could really hope for. And if that's something that you are into, then I don't want to sound like I'm kind of poo-pooing on your good time. Like, by all means, I think there are plenty of people out there that will love this musical. I just recognize that in this instance, it wasn't for me, and that's okay. So, in the style of the show, I'm going to take a leaf out of their book here. Out of 5, what would I rate Bake Off? Well, oh, you want a score? Oh yeah, you'll have to read the print version of this review for that. Sorry.